Here you go. That's fine. Good morning. I'll start in English as well. I have advantages opposed to some younger colleagues here. I've been with BEROC long enough to start with the first conference that I remember, and I hope this is not the last one, obviously. Let me say briefly about BEROC. There is no, especially for those who don't know, we don't have any alternative to another center of international research and local education and local policy. So my hope with organizations that it continues for many years, simply because we don't have anybody else to take the place of BEROC. So anyway, let me start with my most recent work. This is I work in finance and theoretical finance mostly. The new project on related to corporate hedging and derivatives. So I'll try to adopt the slides to make it easy, even if you do not know much about the topic. Anyway, so first of all, what is hedging, also known as risk management? That is the financial way of reducing risk. This is usually using some kind of derivative such as swaps or options to ensure that the company does not go into state of distress and does not default. Given how I explain it, given how I give the notion of hedging and derivatives, it's easy to understand that it's most valuable when company is close to financial distress. So if the company is very risky, the company is already compromised, this is when it needs the most the portfolio of the derivatives to make sure that no further risks can jeopardize its value. Given this concept, many of the previous papers argued that because of the management risk, personal risk aversion, or because of possibility of distress, risk management is the most valuable for distressed companies. However, empirically, we see that companies that are close to default, companies that are distressed, they're actually the least likely to use derivatives and use hedging. So why is that? A possible explanation came up based on the ISA constraint, that's Rampini-Vestavasan literature. That literature argues that because of collateral constraints, the firm has to choose either to invest or to do risk management. Therefore, risk management is insufficient because the company already has no money for investment. The simple explanation sometimes is that the company is close to distress. They are too distracted to think about the risk management because they have other problems. Anyway, so what is this paper about? We look deeper into how the hedging is done. It's done not how we usually imagine. You cannot go to the market. You cannot buy those options on the market. Usually you have to sign a contract, and the way those contracts are signed is governed by specific contract, which is the same for all over-the-counter, that's like person-to-person, entity-to-entity transactions in the United States. It's so-called master agreements, that they're all the same for all transactions, and those master agreements dictate that if there is some event of default, which I'll explain in a second, there is an option for the counterparty to terminate the whole portfolio. We argue two things in this paper. First of all, this option to terminate derivatives if the company is in distress explains low level of corporate hedging, contrary to theoretical literature. And second, we investigate the value of this option and the exercise strategy for this option, so that for the methodological purposes we understand what's going on. Okay, so that's pretty much overview. And I'll try to explain as much as possible. I'm skipping all literature and going straight to contracts. So what are we talking about? So it started in the United States about 30 years ago, and now it's pretty much all over the world. There is an organization called ISDA. So for example, you go to United Kingdom, you have to sign an ISDA contract. Or for example, there is ISDA here in Germany and Lithuania. That's organizations that governs common contract for the derivative transaction between the counterparty, think of some large bank like Deutsche Bank, and the company, think of some like oil company. So the oil company contracts with Deutsche Bank, they sign this contract, which is the same for everyone. It's 10 pages approximately. So in this contract, somewhere in the end of this contract, there is part that says when this contract can be terminated, and it's contingent on the so-called event of default. What is event of default? The contract gives 8 standard events of default and gives addendum with additional events of default. It's basically any kind of default. So the company did not pay, the company did not make a payment on current transactions. It can be triggered if there is a large credit downgrade. It's also triggered if there is a merger without full assumptions of all liabilities. It could be if they don't file documents and a couple other things. So basically, when something is wrong with agreement, then it automatically triggers event of default and the whole portfolio can be terminated. Okay, so it's important that upon triggering the event of default, there is an option but not the obligation to terminate the whole contract. So we investigate when this option is terminated and when it's not. And there is some kind of grace period. So immediately the company does not need to see that all of its agreement is gone. There is some time for the counterparty to think whether they will terminate or not. Okay, so here's now closer to examples. Here are the examples that we see in annual statements. So by the way, from the finance perspective, so maybe as most of you economics people, so let's say you need to know something what's going on in the company. The advantage of finance, you can go to if it's a public company, you go to the website for Security Exchange Commission, you download the annual statement of this company, and although it's a very large document, you can read through the statement, figure out what was the derivative portfolio, why they don't have derivative portfolio, what financial troubles they experience. So you can pretty much know everything. So they say directly, here's a company, Aurora Oil Company, that hedged with BNP Paribas Bank. They say on 2008, in the middle of the crisis, we received a notice for early termination from BNP Paribas with respect to our natural gas and interest rate swap derivatives. So what it means in simple language is that the bank sends a notice to the Aurora oil company saying that because you did not make one of the timely payment, all of your portfolio is immediately terminated. So similar examples for other companies, except maybe for we found some examples in annual statements of other companies that are not related to defaults at all. So here's one example when companies were hedged with Morgan Stanley, and they, for whatever reason, in 2020, they were not able to make disclosure about their current financial position immediately. And as they don't timely file the 10K, which is annual statement, or they don't make some disclosures that are required by the agreement, it triggers the event of default and all portfolio is terminated. Okay, so I hope I gave you some idea. So now let me go through literally 5 quick pages of the model to give you an idea of what we're trying to capture, and then I'll explain to you empirical work. Okay, so we built simple binomial model, so it's not a continuous time, it's not a derivative value, not a kind of option value model as you might usually expect here, because we simply wanted to capture for now the intuition of option exercise. So without going into mathematics, here's what the model does. We have a company that initially is healthy. The company signs the agreement for hedging, so it signs, for example, with a counterparty with BNP Paribas. It has a hedging contract in place, and 2 situations are possible. The company either remains, so think about some kind of binomial trace, like good situation, bad situation. In a good situation, the company remains healthy and nothing interesting happens. So it is very high probability. Think about 90%. With some small probability, say 10%, the company experiences distress and goes into a state of default. For example, it fails to deliver some payment, or it experiences a credit downgrade, or it violates one of its covenants. So the model basically starts in this bad state of the world. We assume the company triggers this bad event, and we start from there. Conditional on this bad event, we assume a single number v, which is value of its derivative portfolio, to the counterparty. To make concrete example, there is, say, bank that signs the derivative, say Wells Fargo. That's a value of this derivatives to Wells Fargo, and minus v is a negative value of the derivatives to the firm itself. Now, so anyway, what do we have? We have a company that can default, can get into event of default with some probability, and now it experiences distress, and there is some derivative portfolio that we need to describe further. Now, some of you are familiar with contracting literature. So you know, in contracting literature, let's think about Tirol's textbook, for example, if you're familiar with it. Without any further what we call frictions, there is nothing really. So contract is fair, it's signed, at the end contract is resolved, nobody is worse off, nobody is better off, there is nothing interesting. So to make sure that there is something interesting, we introduce frictions. Here's my frictions. First of all of these frictions are taken directly from the annual statement. We just put in the mathematics what companies say in the statement about the derivative portfolio. First of all, there is a value to the counterparty of continuing doing business with the firm. So basically, in plain words, the bank wants to continue business with the corporation that's hedged. They don't want to cut the contract because they know it would be hard to establish new contract. So we put a value theta on continuing contract. Second, we recognize that after the contract is in place, and there is an event of default, so the company is already in this bad state, they're already not doing too well. There are two possibilities. The company can either be liquidated if the things become even worse, or the company can recover. So we must recognize that this probability of recovery also depends on having derivative. If derivatives are in place, it's easier for company to recover. We also must describe realistically what happens if the company does go into full default and liquidated. And there, from how this companies describe the process, the bank, the counterparty, has two incentives. If they have to pay to terminate the contract, then they would probably delay liquidation because, like the case of Lehman Brothers has shown, the resolution of the process takes a long time, and if you must provide the payment with a termination notice, then it's much better not to terminate at all. The second, on the other side, if the counterparty, think about the large bank, is expected to receive payment with a termination notice, then they have high incentives to do this sooner, because if the corporation goes into default, then it's much harder to recover money from defaulted companies than to recover money from the companies that's still alive. So we introduce this as cost alpha and cost gamma that are proportional on the value of the derivative. Okay, so in the interest of time, let me just show you very brief mechanics of the model. So again, simplistically, you have a firm that's healthy and signs some derivatives. Could be nothing, could be the firm could continue as a healthy firm, or it could go to event of default. So this is already low state. From low state, you can go to even lower state, which is liquidation, or you can recover. The probability of recovery depends whether this P depends on whether company has derivatives. And if it does recover, nothing interesting happens except that there is a value of continuing and having those derivatives in the future. If it doesn't recover, then there are some costs on positive or negative portfolio. So we take it basically into, let me skip to this formula. We'll take it to mathematical expressions, and we get to the formula. In the interest of time, I'll only focus on the exercise formula that shows that exercise of the option, we're talking about the option to terminate all derivative portfolio, depends on the value of continuing business. So the larger the value of continuing business with the firm, the less likely the portfolio is to be terminated. It depends on the deadweight cost of bankruptcy. So intuitively, the more costly is the bankruptcy, the less likely the bank is to leave money with the company when company is about to go into full default. And the value of renegotiation. So intuitively, if the counterparty must provide the payment with terminated derivatives, it actually wants to drag the feet and don't provide this payment, because it's very likely, like in Lehman Brothers, which defaulted in 2008, but until now the payments are not fully made. So it's beneficial not to make this payment immediately. Okay, so Okay, that's about the model, and I will not go into any extensions or anything. Now let me use maybe my remaining couple minutes to talk about empirical results. So like I mentioned, I usually work with modeling. So this particular project was interesting to me for a couple of reasons, because we had to assemble very large amount of data. So instead of kind of going through the details of tables, which I can do, let me just explain to you interesting data that we use in this project. So we needed 3 types of data to describe the process of derivatives in the company. First of all, most importantly, we had to know the details of the derivative portfolio for each company. Where do you get it? You only can get it from the annual statements, so you need to read basically manually through this annual statement, figuring out how much these companies hedge. Second, you want to know when these portfolios were terminated. So for this, you need to, again, go to annual statements and find those places to see where the portfolio was terminated. Finally, since the termination of all derivative is contingent on the events of default, we have to find those events of defaults. So let me start with this. So events of default we find through several standard databases, and my colleagues that provided the full set of 3,000 derivatives for United States corporations that filed for either Chapter 7, Chapter 11, or experienced any kind of default in distress. For the amount of hedging. So for the hedging, we did 2 things. First of all, we assembled a very detailed sample of the derivative transactions for companies that are in oil and gas production, in coal, in airlines, and steel producers. So there are 2 advantages here. First of all, for those companies, you know what they hedging and how much they hedging if you look in the statements. It's not possible for any other industries. Second, we can spend a lot of time kind of, because it's a small sample, it's only about 2,000 firms total, we're able to read it in detail, so we're able to identify everything. We don't need to rely on mechanical ways of collecting this information. But because you also want to kind of to establish this for the whole universe of firm, we also run it for all public firms, the same search. How do we do this? I use textual search. So I have a new program that basically downloads all annual statements for all companies for all years and just mechanically searches through the statements. To identify whether companies hedge or not, we collect the number of the words related to hedging, such as hedge, risk management, forwards, forward contract, futures, and swaps. And the more times the firm mentions it, the more likely that it has hedging portfolios, and we divide it, normalized by the number of words. We also look for the termination of derivatives. So for this, we have a 3-step process that identifies the paragraphs where they're likely to talk about the derivative being terminated. We identify those paragraphs, we save them in the files, and we read manually, and eventually we confirm that the portfolio was terminated. So very briefly about the results. Now I want to point to just a couple numbers. For the small sample of commodities, we see that many of the, out of about 4,000 year firm observations, we observe 140 that had distressed firms, and about 95 that result in derivative termination. So if I put it briefly on a graph, calling 0 the event of default. So think about this firm either defaulting or experiencing credit downgrade or triggering the covenant violation. You see the derivative portfolio that we estimate to be 40% on average goes to pretty much 0 during this year, and that recovers in the long term. Usually this is explained by firm not being able to hedge or not willing to hedge during this transaction. Our point is much simpler, that the portfolio is mechanically terminated because of the agreement, because of the contract infraction. So we separate these firms into the firms that are going through expensive bankruptcy or going through cheap, so kind of prepackaged bankruptcy. And we see that for cheap bankruptcy, there is no effect on hedging, which is consistent with the model prediction that for cheap bankruptcy, the portfolio can be terminated at no cost. And for other firms, you can see there is a significant effect. So let me see. Here we go. So another graph that I want to show you, because we can look in annual statements and we know that portfolios were terminated, we can separate our sample into the subsample of the firm when we know there are terminations, and we confirm that hedge ratios are much lower for those firms, and the firms that did not say that they terminated the derivatives, but they could, and for those we can see the red line, we can see that there is no change. So we run a number of these tests, basically confirming that terminations have significant effect. Let me show this last result and probably end here. So we run also a number of placebo tests to show that the contractual terminations are responsible for low hedge ratios. We look, for example, in coal industry. So here's what's going on in coal industry, again, because you probably wouldn't know about derivatives. In the coal industry, what they do is they use several inputs and they produce coal. So it turns out that they don't hedge the coal production. The production of coal, so they produce, say, 100 million tons of coal. It goes through the so-called supply agreements. So the coal producing company already has a predetermined price, say like $1,000 per ton, at which they produce the coal and sell it to consumers. What they hedge is a fuel derivatives. So because they use a lot of diesel fuel to produce the coal, that's a derivative that they use. So we take a coal industry as a placebo and we separate the hedge ratios for diesel derivatives, which is subject to credit terminations, and coal supply agreements, which is also hedging, but it's not subject to any agreements about cancellation. It's not subject to terminations. And of course, we see that for the diesel derivatives that can be subject to termination, during the distress, the hedge ratios significantly fall. And for the coal supply agreement, which is also hedging but does not use derivatives and not subject to termination, there is no effect at all. So by this, we confirm that there is a simple mechanism behind changing derivatives values. Okay, so I don't want to keep you over time, and I'm skipping the rest of it. What do we find? So we this is one of the projects that we've done in the hedging and the derivatives on the corporate level. The literature before us argued that companies that are distressed, corporations, do not hedge because usually they are constrained about the hedging. For example, they don't have enough collateral to hedge if they are already distressed. We show in this paper that the reason may be much simpler than was thought before. Because all derivatives in the companies that were used in previous studies use one type of agreement, ISDC master contract, the derivatives are simply automatically cancelled when the companies are distressed. And because they're automatically cancelled, we see empirically that those companies do not hedge sufficiently if they're distressed. So we provide much simpler explanations for what had complex explanation before. We also explore when this option to terminate derivative is exercised and the ex-ante value of this option. Okay, so thank you for your attention and good luck with the rest.
We still have some time for questions, actually, plenty of time. So any questions are welcome. And we have to use the microphone so that people in Zoom and YouTube hear us.
Probably. Left hand.
Okay, so thank you. And correct me if I understood it wrong. So this hedge is actually not a real hedge because these hedgers cancel it once something starts to go wrong. And like the only reason why they won't cancel basically this insurance is because of friction of this reestablishing this contract. And then why won't? Well, I don't understand, of course, this world. Why won't somebody invent real insurance?
So I see. So Lev's question is basically can be translated like this: if these derivative contracts that are meant to preserve, to keep the firm from going to default, are cancelled in default, yeah. What kind of insurance they provide? So the answer is as follows: so derivative contracts, at least corporate derivative contracts, are settled every couple of months. So they work as intended as a firm kind of doing worse and worse. For example, it's exposed to falling oil prices and the company produces oil. It's an oil pumping company. Then as the situation becomes worse and worse, they keep receiving payment from the derivative counterparty. So they helped in this situation. What I'm describing is when the situation cannot be helped. So they received payment from the bank, they received payment from the bank, but they still violated one of the covenants in the end. Then all the portfolio is terminated at this point. So what we argue is if the situation became very bad, the company actually defaulted on one of its obligations, it had all of the portfolio terminated, and then it cannot, at this point, it cannot survive, or it's harder to survive further, because in this critical point when it really needs portfolio derivative, it doesn't have it. But it doesn't mean that the portfolio is meaningless, because there were several years probably when it received payment before the termination.
Okay, and then another question. So in your model, it's basically everything is exogenous. People are not making decisions, and company is not making a decision. But what if you would acknowledge incentives of firms? So if this would be not just like random shock, but strategic behavior of firms with respect to like doing all these obligations and not, how it should change this picture?
Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. So the company is passive here, so they're basically victim of the derivatives counterparty. Now, it could be easily extended in several ways. So first of all, the company has discretion to sign or not to sign derivative agreement. So you could consider those situations, whether they go into agreement or they don't go into agreement. Second, the company has decisions about whether to issue debt or not, which increases or decreases its risk. And other than that, the company basically has no... Oh, there is one more thing. The contracts are two-sided, the derivative contracts, which means that if anything goes wrong with the company, the bank has the right to terminate all transactions. But if anything goes wrong with the bank, the companies have a right also to terminate the portfolio. And that happens two times. With Enron company, there was a large oil derivatives company, and the second time with Lehman Brothers, for which I was supposed to work for Lehman Brothers, but I didn't go there, luckily. So Lehman Brothers defaulted with a 6,000 master agreements. So all of this master agreement counterparties, they had to decide whether they terminate the transactions with Lehman Brothers or not. In this case, that's not the company that went into default, that's a derivative provider that went into default. So they also have some role, which we don't model in this model.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
To follow up to some extent on Lev's question, let's give it a name. It's called risk shifting. So my basic question is, why do you find puzzling the fact that distressed companies don't hedge? They're limited liability companies. You're only looking at publicly traded ones. They don't have incentive to fully hedge. They have incentive to risk shift and become riskier. And secondly, unrelated second question is, why not look directly at cancellation since you have it in the data? So you're showing that the overall hedging drops in the period of default, but that could be due almost entirely to risk shifting. Why not plot how much of that is due to actual passive cancellations of the existing contracts? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. So question. So let me briefly explain what. It's a good question. Let me briefly explain what risk shifting means on the corporate side. It's when companies have liabilities. For example, they have debt with a senior lender. They might have incentive not to survive, but they actually have incentive to increase their risk, because if they default, they're not liable for payments, and if they survive, they get their money back. Now, so there is, well, first of all, conceptually, there is a big question whether the risk shifting exists for distressed companies, because like managers, they obviously want to stay in power as the companies want to survive. So there is an empirical question whether risk shifting takes place for distressed companies or not. So the conclusion on the empirical side is basically risk shifting may appear in some cases, but in many cases it does not appear empirically. Now, there is other thing. The hedging is controlled partially by the lenders. So the senior lenders in the credit agreements, they have very large part that says how you can use derivatives and how you should use derivatives or not. So basically the bank tightly controls the risk management for the company, and in fact they say what happens if your derivative is terminated. They try to reinstate it as soon as possible. So in fact the bank, who would be the victim of the risk shifting, has a control over how those derivatives are placed between the company and the counterparty. So basically, the easiest way I can explain to you is there are three parties in these transactions. Usually there is a company that wants insurance, there is a bank, there is one bank that provides insurance, like you think of Wells Fargo, and there is a lender who would be affected if the company does not have insurance.
Oh, I already have the microphone. Exactly, for the risk shifting. I'm just thinking why the companies would be interested to hedge, and why is it really under hedging the problematic? Because from the point of view of investors, you have the company, a risk-return trade-off. So if you want to invest in a risky company, you do that. If you want to manage the risk, you buy CDS, insurance, or anything else of clients themselves. So companies shouldn't be really caring much about this. Right.
So yeah, several questions, all good questions. So CDS, like it's a popular, CDS is credit default swaps that's supposed to provide you with a perfect insurance against your own default. So supposedly the company can buy insurance on its own default and always get rid of, but this only works in model. In reality, they're too expensive to buy. So nobody in practice does it. So now about risk shifting. So again, risk shifting, even theoretically, it works well if you have like, imagine binomial setup when you take a very large risk and the gambles pays off, you are paid, and gambles fails and you are deep under, right? And then the lenders have to pick up the rest. But here the reality is that you have a continuous hedging agreement, so you have a lot of payments in between. Then you get to the point when you have no money, basically you already defaulted on some of the obligations. And at this point, you can risk shift, but basically all you win is you out of business or you in business with a little bit of money, but there is not much of put option. You're not going to win much even if you decide to risk shift. So my assumption and my understanding from manual agreement is that managers want to keep the companies afloat at this point because they keep employees in place, they keep their salaries, but there is not much benefit at this point of changing risk. Thank you for your questions. I want to make sure that others have time.
Oh.